I was recently listening to the Determined Truth podcast regarding Rob Dalrymple's theories about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or as he has decided to rename it, the tree of knowledge of good and bad. Rob theorized that God intended Adam and Eve to eventually eat from the tree, once they had gained maturity, so that they could fully realize their role as rulers over the earth. Now, before I begin my critique, I want to point out one glaringly obvious matter, and that is the fact that the Adam and Eve story is completely fictional. I go into this topic more in depth in my video entitled, "Is a Literal Adam and Eve Important?" And I would encourage you to view that video if you have any questions regarding whether Adam and Eve actually existed. So I'm not going to get into it here, but for the sake of evaluating Rob Dalrymple's theories, let's assume argumendo that the story is literally true. Mr. Dalrymple asserts that Adam and Eve eating the fruit was mankind's way of deciding good and bad for themselves, rather than to let God decide what is good and bad. The results, he asserts, is that the governments of the world have chosen to rule their nations through self-interest and based upon power, which leads to various forms of exploitation. I'm not going to get into a discussion on political theory at this time, but rather, I would like to look into what government looks like when God is in charge. According to the Bible, God gave specific instructions to the Jewish people through the prophet Moses and later Joshua. But before we begin, I must, however, add yet another caveat, in that Exodus and the conquest of Canaan did not happen as is written in the Bible. For reference, I would encourage you to seek out the works of Israel Finkelstein, the Jewish archaeologist who spent his career trying to dig up evidence for the conquest. I would also encourage you to read the book Exodus by Professor Richard Elliott Friedman. Professor Friedman is one of the preeminent Old Testament scholars in the world today and makes an argument for the true origin of the Moses myth and legend. The reality is that the conquest of Canaan did not occur, and Moses is a legendary figure. There may have been a real person for whom the story is based, but most of the biographical details that we find in the Bible about Moses were probably written down in the Babylonian exile and are not true in a literal sense. Without belaboring the point, I would just conclude by saying that if you want definitive proof that the conquest in the book of Joshua did not occur, all you have to do is cross-reference the cities that were supposedly conquered by Joshua with the very same cities that we find in the book of Judges that were still occupied by the enemies of the Jewish people. The book of Joshua and Judges are hopelessly contradictory, and a simple cross-reference with a map will show you this. With these caveats in place, let's test Mr. Dalrymple's argument and assume argumendo that the commands that God gave Moses and Joshua were recorded accurately in the Bible. What did God command the children of Israel to do when he was directly involved in telling them how to run their society? So let's look at Numbers, chapter 31, verses 1 through 18. And God spake unto Moses, saying, Avenge the children of Israel of the Midianites. Afterwards shalt thou be gathered unto thy people. And Moses spake unto the people, saying, Arm some of yourselves unto war, and let them go against the Midianites, and avenge the Lord of Midian. Of every tribe 1,000, throughout all the tribes of Israel shall ye send to the war, so that there was delivered out of the thousands of Israel 1,000 of every tribe, 12,000 armed for war. And Moses sent them to the war, 1,000 of every tribe, them and Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, to the war, with the holy instruments, the trumpets to blow in his hand. And they warred against the Midianites, as the Lord commanded Moses, and they slew all of the males. And they slew the kings of Midian, beside the rest of them that were slain, namely Evi, and Rechem, and Zur, and Hur, and Reba, 5 kings of Midian. Balaam was also the son of Beor, they slew with the sword. And the children of Israel took all the women of Midian captive, and their little ones. and took the spoil of all their cattle and their flocks and their goods, and they burnt all the cities wherein they dwelt, and all the goodly castles with fire, and they took all the spoil and the prey, both men and beasts, and they brought the captives and the prey and the spoil unto Moses and Eleazar the priest, and unto the congregation of the children of Israel, unto the camp at the plains of Moab, which are by Jordan near Jericho. And Moses and Eleazar the priest, and all the princes of the congregation, went forth to meet them without the camp. And Moses was wroth with the officers of the host, and with the captains over the thousands, and the captains over the hundreds, which came from the battle. And Moses said unto them, Have ye saved all the women alive? Behold, these caused the children of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to commit trespass against the Lord in the matter of Peor, and there was a plague amongst the congregation of the Lord. Now therefore, kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman that hath known man by lying with him. But all the women children that have not known a man by lying with her, keep alive for yourselves. It's often argued, in one way or another, that the victims of these massacres deserved what they had coming to them because of how evil they were. This is an example of victim blaming. However, there is no evidence that the Midianites were any more or less brutal than the contemporaneous Bronze Age societies. The lurid stories of human sacrifice and tossing babies into the fire of Molech are slanders and have no basis in actual history. But assuming arguendo that the Midianites did commit atrocities, how should they have been dealt with? Let's contrast how the God of the Bible would have us deal with the Midianites and with how modern democracies handle atrocity. When the Nazi regime in Germany was toppled in 1945, the United Nations established war crimes tribunals, commonly referred to as the Nuremberg Trials. In these trials, the crimes of the Nazi regime were prosecuted and judgments rendered. During these trials, culpability was established using evidence and eyewitness testimony. Those who were considered less culpable were given lighter sentences, whereas many who were in positions of power and were instrumental in enabling the Holocaust received capital punishment. It's important to point out that at no point did the judges at the Nuremberg trial order the execution of children of any of the Nazi officials, nor did they allow for the forced marriage of the virgin daughters of the Nazi officials to the bachelors within the Allied armies. It is stunning that the God of the Bible, who's supposedly morally superior to secular governments, would not only allow indiscriminate slaughter of children, but would positively command it. Ask yourself if the behavior of the victorious Allied armies in World War II was morally inferior to how the ancient Israelites supposedly treated their enemies. If you think these stories are true, that God actually spoke to Moses, then you have to admit that there was at least some small children who were caught up in the commands and the actions of Numbers chapter 18. Do you honestly think that a 4-year-old child deserves to be executed by the Israelite army for some supposed sin that his parents may or may not have committed? If the answer is yes, then I would say that you have allowed your religion to pervert your moral sensibilities. If the answer is no, then I ask you, why do you worship this monster? All children deserve to be loved and cherished. The execution of children is never justified. No matter how bad the actions of the parents might have been, the execution of children is never justified. But there is some good news on this rather bleak topic. The good news is that the horrific atrocities depicted in the books of Moses and Joshua did not actually occur. They're just sadistic fictions that have more in common with the perverted writings of the Marquis de Sade than of any actual historical book that should be taken seriously.